good morning, Discovery, and a special good morning for Joe.
Astronauts aboard the Shuttle Discovery woke up this morning to a Latin beat. They might have been dancing right off. The song was played for astronaut Joseph Acaba, NASA's first Puerto Rican man in space. Today's main task is to help install the final set of solar arrays on the International Space Station. And the construction job during a spacewalk is tricky enough, but the astronauts have something else to worry about as well: space junk. Talmon Firestone can take us into the details. He's mission specialist with the Canadian Space Society. So I think the spacewalk is set to get underway in less than 2 hours from now.
Yep.
Let's just talk about the spacewalk. What exactly is involved? It's 6.5 hours. 2 astronauts will be out there. What are they doing?
So this spacewalk, they'll be basically assembling a framework that'll hold the final segments of the solar arrays for the International Space Station. And with those solar arrays being deployed, it'll give the International Space Station 100% power that it was intended to have upon its design.
So it's a really important final phase
Yes.
of getting that power system up and running. Whenever you watch astronauts on these spacewalks, it's always, well, the pictures are beautiful, but they move so slowly. Often it doesn't look like they're moving much at all. But I gather, particularly with this spacewalk coming up, this is physically quite grueling for the astronauts, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's the reason they're always moving slowly is because in space, you don't have ground to push yourself off of, so they've got to really grab corners of the space station, pull themselves, and then make sure that when they're moving another object, it's
Right.
relative to the International Space Station. And they could be moving 100 tons in one arm while holding on another, and they'll be able to move it because there's no weight in space, right?
Now, I'm assuming that with less than 2 hours to go, this spacewalk is good to go. But we remember last week when NASA was concerned about space junk around the space station itself, which reminds us, what is space junk and how big a problem can this be?
Space junk is a huge problem, and luckily it's a popular issue that's being discussed now, which is really the fact that we're discussing it is ultimately this is the long-term solution. But
Okay.
space junk itself is really, leftover bolts and nuts and paint flecks and chunks of spacecraft and the debris from accidentally exploded satellites and fuel tanks and little chunks of this, that, and the other thing that end up in orbit, moving around the Earth at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour.
Just as you're talking, we're showing an artist's rendition of Earth with the space junk around it. And I'm looking at that going, boy, the cosmos are pretty crowded right now. Does that ring true when you look at that and see so much around the Earth? Is it like that?
Well, that's really, I believe that picture was an artist's rendition of what it could be like if we didn't address the issue. But also, each one of those white dots may represent only a few centimeters sized object. So the white dot relative to the picture is much bigger. It thus makes it look much more crowded. And while that large density is an issue for space, when you're up in space, you're not often seeing objects. Yet again, once a year, something may happen, or twice a year, something may come a bit too close, and you'll want to avoid it.
Yeah, we're looking at some former spacewalks, and certainly you're right. You don't see anything there that would suggest that, they're rubbing elbows with space junk per se. I always thought that space junk were old satellites that just continue to orbit, but it's much more than that. Actually, it can be something quite small, but equally a menace, right?
Yeah, when I was reading up on this, I found out that there was over 18,000 space objects that are larger than a baseball in size.
Wow.
And then there's probably a larger number of ones that are even smaller, as I was saying, paint flecks and bolts and nuts.
So these are just bits and pieces from various spacecraft, right?
Yes, exactly. As I was saying, I mean, even if you remember a few missions ago, one of the astronauts had accidentally let go of a tool.
I remember that.
That tool is still floating in space.
And what is the concern there? I would assume that, a tool floats in space, no big deal if you brush up against it, but is it traveling so fast that it could be like a bullet if an astronaut was working outside the space station and that bolt or tool smacked into them, it could do some serious damage?
Well, in the case of the tool, it was dropped in the same relative speed and direction as the International Space Station, so that object will not likely be a problem. But imagine when a spacecraft explodes, it lets off junk in all directions.
Right.
So when you've got the International Space Station traveling in one direction at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour, and you've got something traveling in the opposite direction, maybe the size of a bullet.
Not good.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what needs to be done to make sure that space junk is addressed now so that residents of the International Space Station aren't worrying about this in a huge way in the not too distant future.
Well, ultimately, the long-term solution to the problem is mitigating future space debris, and then over time, what is there right now will slowly decay. The orbit will decay, and it'll be burned up in the atmosphere. So time itself will solve this problem in the long run. Of course, there have been some really sci-fi style solutions that have been suggested. As an example, there would be magnetic fields to try to push some debris down towards the Earth,
right,
or laser-based systems that can either burn up or just push down more debris. One of the wackiest ones I read about was a very large globule of, what's it called, aerogel, that just goes up and kind of, it's like a giant sponge. Yeah, exactly. It's a giant space sponge that would capture the smallest bits as it hit them. But that's just been, radical suggestions. Ultimately, time is the solution, and really it's reducing what we put up there now so that we don't further clutter our local environment in space.
Okay, wow, fascinating. Talmon, good to talk to you. Thanks for this.
Thank you very much.
More news still ahead on CBC.